Your electricity bill is quietly helping pay for big tech's data centers, and most people have no idea that is actually happening. A new analysis shows that billions of dollars in power grid upgrades are being shifted onto everyday customers like me and you to support cloud computing and AI. But before we get into that, hi, I'm Danielle, and I'm an attorney and tech policy professional, and I help everyday people just like you understand how technology, policy, and law actually shape our lives. And today I want to break down a report that reveals how this cost shifting is happening and why it matters right now. So let's get into it. So, the analysis comes from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and it focuses on something called the PJM interconnection. Now, PJM operates the largest electricity grid in the United States, serving roughly 65 to 67 million customers across 13 states from the Midwest to the Mid Atlantic. It manages power flows, wholesale electricity markets, and long term infrastructure planning. But it is not a utility itself. PJM is basically the air traffic control system for electricity. It doesn't generate power and it doesn't send you a bill, but it does decide how electricity moves across the states, when upgrades to the grid are needed, and how those costs get shared. In recent years, data centers have become one of the biggest drivers of electricity demand growth on the grid, largely because, again, of cloud computing and AI workloads. But here's the part that the average citizen hasn't heard. In 2024 alone, power companies in 7 states approved 130 projects to build new, heavy duty power lines and equipment just so data centers could plug into the grid. But that's not even the important part right now. Here's the crazy part. More than 95% of those costs were passed on to the consumers through their electricity bills, not just to the data center companies that caused them. So in total, about 4.3 billion in transmission costs were shifted onto ratepayers like you and me in just 1 year. So even if you've never benefited from a data center being built near you, you're still likely helping to pay for it. So what's happening is that instead of requiring data centers to cover the costs they create, like traditional power plants are required to do, the current system bundles transmission expenses into statewide utility rates. So what that means is households and small businesses are subsidizing these massive facilities with very little transparency on how or why. And specifically where I currently live in Virginia, which is the largest data center hub in the world, the report shows that just under 2 billion in data center related transmission projects were approved in that state alone in 2024. If you do the math, that's nearly half of the 4.3 billion total across the 7 states the PJM reviewed. Insane. And with data centers popping up all over the place like Walmart's, you can now see it's not just about who pays, it's about what happens if this keeps going unchecked. Grid operators like PJM have warned that electricity demand is growing faster than the system was built for, with data centers among the biggest drivers of that growth. And if data centers keep coming online without better planning and cost controls, it increases the risk of higher long-term electricity costs, grid stress during peak demand, and emergency measures to keep the lights on. In other words, this is not just a money issue, it's a planning and reliability issue. And because of this, lawmakers are forced to propose real policy solutions right now. There's already movement in the U.S. Congress to deal with this problem more directly. So earlier this year, January of 2026, a group of senators introduced a bill called the Power for the People Act. And the goal of the bill is to stop everyday customers from footing the bill for grid upgrades that are needed mainly to support data centers. And under the bill, data center companies would be expected to pay for the transmission upgrades they trigger instead of having those costs quietly folded onto everyone else's electricity bills. And in some cases, that could also mean bringing their own power sources or offsetting the strain they put on the grid. The legislation also pushes states to treat large energy users differently by creating a separate rate category for facilities like data centers, and it directs federal regulators to make sure grid upgrades tied to a specific data center are paid for by that data center, not spread across the public. So, supporters of the bill, including the Union of Concerned Scientists, say these changes would help protect consumers from rising energy costs and make the power system more transparent and fair. So, back to the report. Now, to address this, the Union of Concerned Scientists calls for several reforms. Some of them have been addressed by that bill, but remember, that's only a bill. It is not law as of yet. So, first, customers that cause new transmission costs, like data centers, should be required to pay for those transmission costs, similar to how generation interconnections are handled today. Second, regulators should create a separate customer class so costs linked to large industrial loads are clearly tracked instead of being hidden in general utility rates. Third, utilities and regulators should be required to track and report cost causation more transparently during rate proceedings. And finally, state and federal policies need to be updated to prevent this kind of cost shifting from continuing to go unchecked. So, in short, the Union of Concerned Scientists want the power system to stop mixing giant data center connection costs with everyone else's bills without oversight. Those costs should be tracked, assigned, and understood, and ideally paid for by the entities that created them. And this is why data centers, AI growth, and energy costs are now being debated together, and why experts and lawmakers are stepping in. So, in closing, if you want to understand how this actually shows up in real communities, especially Black and low income neighborhoods, I go much deeper into this in episode 6 of my podcast called The Miseducation of Technology, available on Spotify, Apple, and right here on YouTube. And I also wrote a companion op-ed in Essence magazine titled AI Data Centers Are the New Environmental Burden Black Communities Didn't Ask For. And you should check that out as well. So if this conversation really matters to you, I've linked both the podcast episode and the op-ed below. And as always, technology may have been miseducated, but you do not have to be. I'll see you next time in the next video. Bye.